That's representation. That can convey a thought, but it's not the photograph that conveys the thought. It's the drama. So you might end up with a representation in some sense, but the photographic element is not presenting any representational element. So that's important to get. It's as if Scruton basically treats photography as if you're just holding up a frame to the world. And he says, well, you wouldn't, if somebody did hold up a frame to that bit of the world, you wouldn't think, oh, that's an amazing representation of that bit of the world. You're just basically getting people to look at the world. You're not telling us anything about the world, you're just pointing to bits of it. So I think he thinks of photography a bit like pointing rather than representing, like conveying thoughts. Now, Scruton is assuming that, because he is a conservative, that not that I think he's wrong in this necessarily, art includes only that which has aesthetic value. So he's a million miles away from Dickey, if you can remember who Dickey is. Like, Dickey had this incredibly loose and liberal account of art that could include really terrible objects as art as long as they had the right kind of institutional context. Scruton isn't like that. He thinks that art, he's got a kind of evaluative conception of art that implies that it has value, aesthetic value. And so if he's saying, as he is, that photography can't really have aesthetic value in its own right, then it sounds like he's saying photography can't be an art form. If photography is an art form, it's not an art form in virtue of any representational capacities. It must be an art form through some other means, and he's pretty quiet about what that might look like. So it doesn't have aesthetically valuable possibilities in virtue of any of its representational capacities, because it doesn't have any representational capacities. It must be an art form through some other mean. As I just sort of implied, I think he thinks that there are no means at all through which photography has aesthetically valuable possibilities. He thinks he's ruled out the only candidate there could possibly be, conveying thoughts. Photography can't do that, so it's not that interesting. A picture of an object can be of aesthetic value only if it's possible to direct an interest towards P independently of one's interest in O. One can't do this if P is a photograph. So this is an extension of the point I just made, where I said he thinks of photography as just like holding up a big frame to the world and saying, look at that. He therefore thinks that your only possible interest in a photograph is what it depicts. Like, you're interested in photography because you want to learn about whatever the photograph is a photograph of. So if you go to a gallery and they've got a collection of war photographs, like photographs of war scenes, whatever that, I can't lost my words. You know, people in battles and things like that. You're only there to find out about battles. You're only there to find out about war. You're not there because you think the photographs are independently interesting, because they have no interest apart from what they show. Equally, if you leaf through Vanity Fair and it's all pictures of film stars, it's the film stars you're interested in. So photographs can be a means, on this view, of giving us information, like really interesting information, but it's not aesthetically valuable in the way that it does it. So it's quite a, as I keep saying, it's a provocative view. It's very annoying to people who like photography. Okay, so here's an objection to the first two points, which I would just remind myself of by going all the way back. So A was a photograph of P. Sorry, a photograph P of an object O is not a representation of O, and B was photography is not a representational art form. It was an argument for them, for those premises, that an ideal photograph stands in a causal relationship to an object, in which case the object has to have the properties which it appears to have in the photograph, and that's the basis for this idea that we can only be interested in photographs for what they show us about the world, because they have to show it us accurately. So they're like a good source of information about the world, because there's no manipulation. They're effectively, essentially accurate. So they've only been produced via a mechanical process. But the objection is, despite this causal relationship between the photograph and the object, the photographer does still have a number of ways to intentionally change the appearance of the image and the objects presented in the image. Okay, so here's the main kind of objection you get to Scruton, is that he has misunderstood and oversimplified the nature of photography, and that actually photographers have a whole range of techniques and choices to alter the image, to make it look different, to make it more or less accurate, more or less truthful. They can intentionally represent their beliefs about the objects through stylistic means. For instance, they can choose a lens, and lens choice can make a huge difference to the picture you get. I'm sure that there must be at least one person here who knows a lot about photography, probably more than me. But I think that's a fisheye lens. Anyway, it's obviously a lens that kind of curves the image close up. And then this is gone in great focus. It's got enormous amounts of detail, whereas the background is very diffuse. But you can do all sorts of things. You can have great depth of field, or you can focus on what's in front. You can also, well, in the old days, we'd say change the film stock, as in the material that the photograph is produced on. These days, with digital imagery, you can have a variety of effects. I must say that digital imagery messes all this up, something chronic. So one of the things you could be thinking about is, how does digital imagery affect Scruton's idea? Because Scruton's idea is that there's this sort of privileged part of the process where there's no manipulation, whereas digital imagery allows you to put filters in at the same time and to mess around at the same time. So the notion of an ideal photograph now gets really lost, I think. Anyway, you can choose film stock. You can choose timing, like when you hit the shutter or press the button. This is, you can't see it very well, but the guy's jumping over a puddle and it looks like he's sort of slightly suspended in the air. You can choose the angle from which you photograph. That's Charlie Chaplin with a chandelier in his head, but obviously it's not on his head, it's just that he's being photographed from an angle which makes it look like it's on his head. Now, I have to say, Scruton wouldn't be that impressed with some of these examples, because he would just say, that's dramatic representation. That's just like taking a frame and putting it around Charlie Chaplin from a certain angle, and whatever's interesting about this image was already happening before you pressed the button. Focus and depth of field I've already mentioned. You can choose to focus in a way that shows you what's going on far in the background, or you can focus on what's going on right in front. That's Francis Bacon, I think. And composition, how the image is distributed within the frame. That's sand dunes, but obviously it looks incredibly abstract. It's very formally interesting in terms of the curves and the tones. And so the photographer has control over all these elements. They can choose where to put the lens, where to aim the lens, so that they can think about the composition, they can think about the tones through the use of film stock or from some other means. They can talk about angle, they can choose a lens which has various effects. And all of these choices that I've mentioned so far, I think, go on before you take the photograph. You make these choices before you take the photograph. So we should probably divide the things a photographer can do into two groups in the old, before pre-digital anyway. What you do before you press the button and what you do after. Now, Scruton's response to these techniques, he thinks that what you might call post-production techniques move away from what he called the ideal of photography. They disrupt this causal relationship which he thought was really important and definitive of photography. I think I've got a hideous example coming up. Yep, there. Now this is post-production, horrible photoshopping going on, but and you can do all sorts of things to an image afterwards, after you've taken it. You can change the colour, you can change all sorts of elements of it. Now, what he's saying about post-production elements is that this makes a photograph more like a painting, because now you've got the photographer making these intentional choices to manipulate the image post-production. Now that's fine, but then he's saying effectively this really isn't a photograph anymore. So maybe this could, I mean not this one because this is hideous, but maybe a photograph that's been really manipulated post-production could convey thoughts of the photographer about the object, and maybe in that sense it would be aesthetically valuable and would be a representation, but it wouldn't be a photograph anymore, because he thinks it's essential to photography that it has this causal, non-intentional relationship with the things it depicts. He also says, on framing and composition, there's a point I've really made already, you wouldn't count the holding of an empty frame to this scene as communicating a thought about this scene. So why should we take composition as that relevant, he thinks. It's just like pointing at those sand dunes and saying, look at this bit. I mean, that's a very reductive way of looking at what photographers are doing. But, okay, just to point out, though, that even those responses of Scruton do not cover the whole range of things that I mentioned. So lens choice isn't something that he's got a response to, because lens choice is not post-production, and it's not just to do with framing. It's literally to do with the sort of image that you produce. So I think what we should at least say is the photographer has limited capacity to alter the image and therefore to convey thoughts about what they're photographing. Then the discussion becomes whether that's particularly powerful. If it's limited compared to the painter, who could literally do anything, they could make any mark they wanted, they could produce any kind of image they wanted, it makes the photographer's capacity to produce interesting representations relatively limited. So it's a more nuanced, that would be a more nuanced position than Scruton's, which is, no, they don't have any capacity, and this is just, oh, they've got some, but it's not very much. Okay, now, just going to finish by focusing on C. And this is Scruton's even more provocative claim about film. So he's trashed photography, or whatever, and now he's moved on to films. Now, films are photographic objects in some sense. They are produced by photographic means, at least partly. And he says that a film, if a film is a representational artwork, it's not an artwork in virtue of any contribution made by photography. So he's taken his conclusion about photography and extended it to film. I think we can find some objections. The first objection is that the cinematographer, just like the photographer, has a range of options, pre-production and post-production, to change the image. So they too can choose lenses, they can choose film stock, they can smear the camera with Vaseline. In the old days, they used to give a kind of blurry image. They have all those basic photographic techniques available to them. They also have, obviously these days, have massive capacity to alter photographic images afterwards by putting CGI in or whatever. So there's that. But I think this is the crucial move, that even if Scruton's arguments worked against still photography, which I think in a way for me they probably do, they don't work for film because there's no such thing. The notion of an ideal film is nothing like the notion of an ideal photograph. So it might be right, maybe it is, that there's this sort of ideal of photography which is a purely mechanical process resulting in a visual image. But there's no such story about the ideal of film, because films are essentially edited objects. Right, a movie is edited. You very, 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 very rarely get a film which is one take. I mean, I can only think of one, and that's Andy Warhol's Empire State Building, where he set up a fixed camera on the Empire State Building for like days, I can't remember, hours at least, and it's incredibly dull. Well, I think so. So, a film is more than a sequence of photographs. It's a sequence of images cut and put into a special order. So there's that. So this is my attempt to convey this point by using stock images. But say that there was a film in which, in the narrative, a woman drank coffee, the clock struck 9:30, and a man lit up a cigarette. That bit could have been filmed first, then that bit, and then they're all spliced together afterwards. So there's no necessary relationship between what was filmed and the order it was filmed in, and the order in which you see the images later. Quite often filmmakers will do the end first, and then the middle next, and then the beginning last, just depending on all sorts of contingent things. So editing, if films are essentially edited, then this is a manipulated process right from the start. It's not just a purely causal, purely mechanical kind of recording of the world with no intentional input. It's already edited. So we can already talk about truth and falsity to the world in a way that arguably we can't talk about that with photography, because you've just always got accuracy. I think, there you go, the appearance of a film as a whole hardly ever reflects the appearance of any actual sequence of events. Now this objection so far, this response, is just to his claim about photography, because he's saying that the photographic contribution of a film is not responsible for any of its aesthetic value. I'm saying that the photographic contribution of a film cannot just be the production of still images or even moving ones, it's the production of edited moving images together. But then another thing you could say, which I haven't got on the handout, is that a film is not just a photographic thing, it's a composite object which has sound as well, quite obviously. I mean, films are not silent movies. So there's an interaction then between the visual and the sound. There's the spoken word, and there's also music most of the time. So my point is, Scruton seems to be thinking of a film as a kind of scaled up photograph, whereas I'm saying a film is a completely different thing, with photographs as an element of it, but lots and lots of other things as essential elements too. So I just don't think his argument translates from film, even if it works for photography. However, you are obviously free to make up your own mind. Any questions about any of this? Anything clear? Yeah?
I was asking, so what is the difference between like a photograph of a snow shovel and an actual snow shovel?
The difference, aesthetically, for Scruton, none. I mean, there's a difference. Like, he doesn't think you could shovel snow with a photograph.
But like, if they're both being put in an art gallery.
Oh, if they're put in an art gallery.
What would be like?
I think he thinks that I mean, it's hard, obviously I don't know what you say, but I'm guessing he'd say there'd be no aesthetic difference arguably the photograph is aesthetically worse because it's smaller. You know, it doesn't give us the full effect. Maybe life size. It's not. Also, the snow shovel's three-dimensional. The photograph struggles with three-dimensionalness. You never mistake a photograph for the thing it's of. So, I think he would say there's differences, but in terms of aesthetic value, the photograph is not bringing anything. Yes.
When we spoke about the Walton support argument, you said something about that a painter can never represent something which did not intend to. But I mean, very often we can see a painting and we can say, oh, it looks like something, while the artist never noticed that, or at least didn't have the intention to make it look like it.
Good. Yes, we definitely can say, oh, that really looks like, you know, someone I know. You go to the National Gallery, you can look at a picture and think it looks like someone you know. But it doesn't represent that person, or it doesn't even depict that person. That's just a coincidence, just like you could look at clouds and say that looks like a bird, but the cloud doesn't depict birds.
But could then it not be the same with photograph? Because I mean, the photograph didn't have the intention to involve that particular bit in it. It just happens to be there as well, but it's not like relevant for the picture itself.
Maybe. I mean, there does seem to be some intentional. There's an intentional action in taking a photograph. So there's a difference between the one I showed you, the picture I showed you, or any of these, in fact, and somebody just like accidentally taking a picture of the bottom of their bag. You know, so you I'm sure on your camera roll all the time you find pictures you didn't mean to take. So these are intentional, but it's just that the elements of the image are not controllable in the same way. So yeah, you could look at him and say, oh, he looks really like someone I know. You could look at a painting, but in neither case, I think, does that have much to do with the content of the picture, because the content of the picture seems to have something to do with either who the picture was of, like who this guy is, or in the case of painting, it's more complicated, but it's something to do with what the artist intended to represent, I think. Any other questions? Okay, right, I'll see you in the seminar.